Today we start looking at the career of Michelangelo, but before we talk about him exclusively, we're going to see how he in the space inside of this building, the Palazzo Vecchio, the government building of Florence. It's been the government building of Florence since it was built at the very end of the 13th century, and it's still the government building of Florence, which is pretty extraordinary. In this space, there were paintings done that would communicate to the Republican senators that were meeting in these spaces within. Um, as the government changes in Florence, we'll see that the painting cycles are redone, the meanings change significantly. But for today, we're going to talk about what was going on in the very beginning of the 1500s when the government is a Republican one. Sorry. So let's look at what's going on in the inside of this space. This is the way this actually looks today. And we'll be talking about this later decoration, all of which was done by the painter and art historian that you've heard about already, Giorgio Vasari. And it is a series of paintings that really celebrate the supremacy of the Medici family and the importance of their Grand Duchy. Needless to say, this is a later decoration that has covered over the original Republican decoration that was commissioned from Leonardo and from Michelangelo. They both were given the task of painting battle scenes that celebrated the triumph of the Florentine Republic over any external threats. There were paintings about the battles with the Sienese and the Pisans and so forth, and those would have decorated these walls and celebrated those triumphs and the stability of the Republican government. When they were given these tasks, what we understand is that Leonardo would have been painting on one side of the room, he would have been over here, and Michelangelo's paintings would have been over on that side. Leonardo nor Michelangelo completed this commission, and in fact, we don't really know how far along Leonardo got with it because all that's come down to us are copies of drawings done of the drawings that Leonardo and Michelangelo had done for these battle paintings. So copies of the drawings that were the studies for what was supposed to be the final project. And some of these copies date to a century after they were working. So and we don't know exactly how accurate some of these studies are, but they're all that we have. What these artists, later artists, are looking at are cartoons that Leonardo and Michelangelo created for this space. Cartoons are large drawings that would be used to plan out the way a wall painting would look. Usually an artist would use those large drawings, they would put them up on the wall that was to be painted, and they would poke little holes through it so that they could then put charcoal dust over it and see, and when they took the paper away, they would see the outlines of what they were, then going to fill in with paint. So those things the cartoons don't usually come down to us in any case. Very rare examples have. So it's not unusual that we've lost these things. But what Vasari tells us is that the cartoons were so beloved and so studied by other artists that, they just kind of disintegrated. They were so well loved and well used. There is some bit of mystery about Leonardo's painting in particular because it's believed by some that Leonardo's painting may actually be behind the paintings that Vasari does here. The thought is that maybe Vasari built a little wall that would cover over the original wall of this space, and that's what his paintings are attached to. And there was some move by art historians in Florence in the past few years to do some investigations and see if if that painting is still there. And they drilled some holes in the canvas. They put a kind of orthoscopic tool behind there to see if they could see anything. And they found pigment and did some test on the pigment that was discovered underneath. So it kind of sounds like there's something under there. Whether or not it's Leonardo's, we'll never know, or at least it doesn't look like we'll know anytime soon, because with the financial crisis in Italy and with some heavy disagreements between art historians, with the conservators and in Florence, this project to see what was underneath was canned, and they have patched up those holes back. And so, who knows? Maybe your generation will actually see them, finding a way to be not less invasive and see what's really underneath these paintings, if anything. So this is the artist Rubens. Rubens was a 17th century Flemish artist of great renown. You may have heard of him. And he loved drama and full-bodied figures, and it's no real surprise that he enjoyed Leonardo's cartoon in particular. So this is what we regard as one of the best examples to show us what Leonardo's original cartoon was like, or at least a section of it was like, but keeping in mind the kind of dramatization that an artist like Rubens of the Baroque period would have, sort of added into this. But, we've seen in other examples by Leonardo, these rearing horses, how he's so interested in the movement of horses and in these intense facial expressions. All of that looks, really pretty rooted in Leonardo. So we take it as being pretty exemplary. This is a link, and I know you can only see part of it, but this is a link I will post in the course materials for you to see this little the news story about this question about whether the painting is underneath there or not. So what we know is that Leonardo abandons the project for the Battle of Anghiari, and Michelangelo never finishes it either. And much has been made of that. Was the competition just a little too intense for Leonardo? Some contemporaries described it that way. Whether that's true or not, I think is debatable. He perhaps lost interest in the project. It was a pretty intense period of time in Florence. There may have been reasons why he wished to leave the city, and we know, in fact, that he did leave soon thereafter and spent a time back in Milan, and also went to Rome and lived in the papal palace, and wasn't really expected to do any commissions, and he just enjoyed the good life and had a little pet lizard that he made wings for and did kind of other a little odd projects like that, before he then moved to France and was in such close contact with the King of France, Francois the First, or Francis the First, and ended up dying in France. His remains were scattered during the French Revolution, and we have no idea what happened to any of them, and little remains of Leonardo's time in France because of later catastrophes like that. So who was this man that potentially caused Leonardo such stress in the course of that project for Palazzo Vecchio? Michelangelo was significantly younger than Leonardo. He's about 25 years younger. And so really of a different generation than Leonardo. And he had kind of a similar start in that his father was a notary like Leonardo's was. The difference between them is that Michelangelo was not a bastard child. His mother was still in the picture, and they were a family that was evidently pretty well off because they were able to afford to send Michelangelo as a baby to be nursed by a nursemaid out in the countryside around Tuscany, which was the norm for families of a certain social status to do. And Michelangelo would have stayed in the household of the nursemaid for the first few years of his life. He, the nursemaid, lived in Settignano. And Settignano is a little hill town out just right outside of Florence. Beautiful place, a place known for stone cutting. And Michelangelo later says that when he was a baby and taking in the nurse's milk, he also took in the dust from the stone, and that's why he became a sculptor. Michelangelo is very interested in creating these kinds of stories about how he began and then different moments in his career that he deemed important. And he tells these stories through an artist, Ascanio Condivi, who was an assistant of his, and as far as we know, not incredibly talented or well learned, but anyway, was who Michelangelo chose to dictate his biography to, and that biography was published um, soon after it was written. Condivi's writing seems to be a response to Vasari's first edition of the Lives, where Michelangelo is described and evidently not described in the way Michelangelo was happy with. So some changes are made in Ascanio Condivi's version, and then those changes are taken into consideration, and some alterations are made in the second edition of Vasari's Lives that comes out after Michelangelo's death. Um, and that edition comes out in 1568. He died in 1564. Michelangelo so in creating these this sort of image of himself, I guess is the best way to think about it. He creates this idea of the artist, an idea or kind of image of the artist that has really stuck with us in a lot of ways. He talked about the artist's need to work in seclusion, that artists are sort of eccentric, sometimes difficult to get along with. They're kind of nonconformist, and especially that artists were born with artistic ability, that they were different in the way they were made by God, and that God had endowed them with these special talents that others did not have. And this was a pretty novel idea, that you were born with artistic ability. Previously, art was seen as something that anybody could learn. You take lessons and anybody can do it. And not that it involves you being born with certain ability. So we really credit Michelangelo and the culture, obviously, that he is flourishing in for creating this idea about the artist. Michelangelo, he was kind of a weird guy. He didn't bathe very often at all, and he wore boots that were made out of dog leather. I mean, there were some weird things going on with Michelangelo. And so he certainly fits into that idea of the eccentric artist that we have, and really that is brought on by the way he lived and how famous he became in his own lifetime. By the time Michelangelo is older, and he lives this incredibly long life, but in his, by the time he's like in his 70s and maybe before, he's being described as being divine. So not only God-given abilities, but to such an extent that he is divine. And that's a pretty incredible thing, especially considering the lowly status that artist had had in previous centuries. I mean, it's really in the course of the 15th century that artists have started to be regarded as being more than just manual laborers. And so Michelangelo, to be called divine even in his own lifetime is truly an extraordinary statement about how quickly um, art has risen in regard in society. This is a portrait of Michelangelo. He's probably about 40 years old here, maybe 50, and he has really characteristic features that allow us to identify him easily. He sometimes will include his portrait in the works he does, and we'll look at some examples of that. And one characteristic that makes him quite easy to identify is this kind of smashed up nose he's got. And I will tell you about that, the story of how he ends up with that nose in just a moment. Michelangelo starts his artistic career in the workshop of the painter Ghirlandaio. And it is much to the chagrin of Michelangelo's father that he takes on this path to becoming an artist. His father expected him to be a notary like he was, and had given Michelangelo a really good education and expected him to use it in the ways that were more traditionally accepted in Upper Florentine society. Michelangelo defies his father and insists on becoming an artist. His father evidently relents to some extent and puts him in this workshop with Ghirlandaio. In addition to his studies with Ghirlandaio, we know that Michelangelo is going around town and looking at the examples of his predecessors. In particular, he is very much influenced by the work of Masaccio, the great Florentine artist from the early 15th century, and by Donatello, the 15th century sculptor, who pretty much covers the majority of the 15th century. I think his death is in 1468. In studying Masaccio, Michelangelo goes to study a specific example of Masaccio's work that is so renowned and still is, and it is Masaccio's work in the Brancacci Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine. And I just show you one example here, and this is the scene. This is the side by Masaccio, and this is the very dramatic moment of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. We see the drama in the faces, and we see obviously a real interest in the depiction of the body and how the body, through gesture and through the way that it's formed, can communicate meaning. And we see Michelangelo in his drawing here, that's obviously after this detail of the fresco, is considering those elements. And already we see he's making some changes, things that we would certainly identify as being perfectly Michelangesque, like the bulkier treatment of the figure, greater muscularity of the male figure in particular, which we'll see is a common element in his later work. As he's in the Brancacci Chapel, he's in there with other young artists that are looking around, studying what they see, and making drawings after them to learn these techniques of the masters of the 15th century. Michelangelo already shows himself to be a difficult personality while he's in this space. And we know that he insults one of the young artists that was in their drawing. His name is Pietro Torrigiani, an artist that eventually ends up in England and works in Spain as well, and is primarily a sculptor. Michelangelo insults his drawing abilities, and Torrigiani was a hot-tempered guy. It got under his skin, and he decided to make Michelangelo pay for the insult. And so he punched Michelangelo in the nose as hard as he could, breaking his nose and forever disfiguring his nose. And that is, in fact, why we see Michelangelo's nose appear the way that it does in his self-portraits. This is a project we know Michelangelo was involved in, or believe that he must have been. This is the high altar chapel of the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and it's done by Michelangelo's painting teacher, Domenico Ghirlandaio. And we actually looked at Ghirlandaio in the last lecture. I compared some of Ghirlandaio's work, a portrait of a woman, the Tornabuoni portrait, and a Last Supper that he did to Leonardo's work. Ghirlandaio was a fabulous fresco painter, and Michelangelo certainly learns the technique of fresco painting from Ghirlandaio. This is a knowledge that will serve him well in his career, especially when, as we shall see, the Pope demands that he paint his chapel for him. And it's a major turning point in Michelangelo's career. Needless to say, it's the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a work that we still know well as one of the great masterpieces of all of the history of art. While he's in Ghirlandaio's studio, he somehow comes to the attention of the current ruler of Florence, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo has a sculpture garden in, well, sort of beside a convent, the convent of San Marco in Florence. And in that garden are pieces of fragments and also full sculptures of ancient Greco-Roman sculptures that were in Lorenzo's collection. And sort of like the Brancacci Chapel, artists would go there and study and learn from looking at these ancient precedents. Michelangelo, we know, was in that garden and is able to study what he sees. He's quite young, but not nearly as young as Zocchi makes him look in this 19th century sculpture. Michelangelo is probably about 16 when he is in the Medici garden doing his studies. And Zocchi's sculpture, while totally inaccurate in terms of the age of Michelangelo, is an interesting reminder of this moment in Michelangelo's life in the garden, because we see him here carving the mask of a faun. He's studying an ancient sculpture of a faun, probably Hellenistic, that was in the sculpture collection, and he is making a replica of it. Famously, Lorenzo is walking around the garden as Michelangelo is working on this piece, and he stops and sees this young sculptor working on it and sees just how talented this kid is. And he stops him and says, it's not bad. It's a first go at it, but you really should make the faun look older. He's supposed to be an old man. You've given him all of his teeth, and old men don't keep all of their teeth. So you haven't made it very accurate. And the young Michelangelo was appalled and embarrassed, and as soon as Lorenzo walks away, he knocks out some of the teeth of the faun and then proudly shows it to Lorenzo again. Lorenzo's so charmed by the boy's ambition and his willingness to please Lorenzo. He was really struck by that and invited Michelangelo to come and live in the Medici Palace. It was an extraordinary move for this young, for this artist, and just in general, in terms of artist-patron relationships, it's highly unusual for such a young artist to be invited to live in the household and be treated as one of the close members of the household. Why this is so significant in Michelangelo's case is that Lorenzo had invited the most renowned writers and philosophers and other men of learning to live in the household and partake in dinner time conversations on a regular basis And Michelangelo is invited to participate in these dinners. And we know that he's really affected by these philosophical discussions that are happening at Lorenzo's table. Especially, we think the conversations regarding Neoplatonism, this philosophy, a Christianized philosophy in the course of the 15th century. This develops as, sort of the Christian take on this ancient philosophy that regards the ideas of transcendence of the soul and how, sort of what it takes to allow the soul to transcend and reach this level of virtue. And the ways that it goes about that, of course, in the Christian context, involves prayer and meditation of the Christian stories and so forth. In any case, we see this take. Some art historians have interpreted Michelangelo's works as being heavily indebted to the ideas of Neoplatonism. So, one can argue if that's been overdone or not. But anyway, it has been a sustained tie, a sustained thread in Michelangelo's scholarship. Anyway, these conversations at the table, the men that Michelangelo gets to know uh, in and around the Medici household obviously are important to him, a real bolster to his career. And it allows him to continue to study the examples of ancient sculptures that are around, like this we regard as a copy of a sarcophagus that Michelangelo saw in the Medici household, and it is a one panel relief, a panel that now resides at the house in Florence dedicated to Michelangelo, the Casa Buonarroti, that has so many of his early works in particular. And in it, we see these interests of Michelangelo's. We see these battling nude males, and it's less the battle that he's interested in than the intertwining of these male forms, the twisting of the body so that it best shows off the musculature. He's really thinking about muscle strain and movement. And we know that he begins doing anatomical studies, dissections, not maybe in the same approach as Leonardo did. His seemed to be less about the science of anatomy and more about learning what he needs to learn so that he can make the human form look as believable as possible, but thinking about muscle and its connection to bone and the way that looks and how it makes the figure move and so forth. A detail here just to show, again, this figure in particular, I think really speaks well to Michelangelo's interest in the male form from a very young age. And it's definitely a theme that's important in Michelangelo's work. The nude male signified virtue, strength, fortitude, all of these positive virtues associated with masculinity, and is used for its significance in that regard as much as it is used as an example of God's design, that God made man to be in his image. And it's the Renaissance artists like Michelangelo really see the male body as embodying divinity, and that's a critical point in Michelangelo's work. In another work by Michelangelo from this same period, from about 1489 to 92, so probably while he's in the Medici household, he does this Madonna of the Stairs. It's a relief, something that's quite unusual in Michelangelo's work, and something, I don't know, he doesn't seem to be quite comfortable with. It's not the only relief he does, but the other reliefs that he does are in private collections, are made for private patrons. This one remains in his household. We don't think it was for a particular commission. And he keeps it in his household for his whole life. And at a certain point, when he's later living in Rome, he writes to his father and begs his father to cover up or hide this relief. We have no idea why. We don't know what his anxieties about it were, but he didn't want anybody to see this. Surely it's not because of the quality of it, because it is really just an extraordinary relief. It has varying degrees of relief, from very low relief to higher relief. He's clearly studying Donatello's reliefs that he did in the course of the mid-15th century of Virgin and Child. These were small devotional reliefs that would be put on altars or be kept in people's homes. And Michelangelo is just sort of following that tradition. But what Michelangelo does so differently here, for one thing, is the treatment of the body of this Christ child, because as you can see, that is one well exercised baby. He's got rippling muscles on his arms and on his back. The Virgin is this really stately figure, monumental, taking up almost all of the surface. I mean, at least half of the surface is taken over by the figure of the Virgin. She's in profile. She looks like a Roman profile portrait, the same kind of image that you would see on a coin, for example. She is seated on this block of stone that's perfectly cut. We have no idea what that block of stone really symbolizes. Over here you have the staircase from which the name of the relief is derived. And the staircase is there because it is a symbol of the Virgin, that she is the staircase to heaven. She's the intercessor that we are meant to pray to so that she can put in a good word with her Son and God, so that we might access heaven. There are these three little angels back here. That's what they appear to be. We don't really know what they're doing. There's been a lot of interpretations of that. We don't know what this guy is doing, kind of holding on to the banister, or is it the beam of the cross that he's raising here, which is meant to foreshadow the crucifixion? It could be, because there's one other reference to the death and crucifixion of Christ, and that is in the baby of Christ child himself, and that the baby looks either asleep or dead, and the shroud, this mantle of the Virgin here, she seems to be either pulling it up or pulling it down over to cover over the Christ child. If in fact we're meant to understand that that gesture is pulling down the drape, it reads as if it was the shroud being pulled over a person's dead body. And of course, that's meant to remind us of, God's plan from the very beginning, that Christ come on earth, that he die and be resurrected. And, we're in Christian iconography of this period, we're constantly reminded of this cycle, even so that even in pictures of Christ infanthood, we see reminders of his death when he's a man. It truly is a beautiful relief, and beyond the interest in the male nude body that we see here in the form of this infant child, we also see his interest in making fabric look and behave like fabric, which is an extraordinary thing to do in stone. And already at this young age, he's doing it with a great deal of skill. You can really get a sense of how light that fabric is as it just barely touches over the head of the boy and then lays down, right, curving right around his shoulders and fits in between the fingers of Mary here. It's really beautifully done. Well, 1492, which is the end date proposed for the Madonna of the Stairs, is a major year in Florence. 1492 is the year that Lorenzo the Magnificent dies, Michelangelo's great patron and really his father figure, dies, and needless to say, that throws Michelangelo into a state of turmoil and confusion, as it does for all Florentines, especially because in the years right before Lorenzo's death, there is a Dominican preacher who comes into great popularity. He's just a huge celebrity of the time, and his name is Savonarola, Girolamo Savonarola. And Savonarola was this charismatic preacher, just an incredibly effective speaker. And he spoke out against what he saw as the excesses of Medici in Florence, of the rebirth of paganism, which he condemned as, that the Medici had brought on, and that it was going to make all of the Florentines go to hell because it was sacrilege. He was so effective in winning over the Florentine opinion about these things that he had these huge bonfires where people would come in and throw away all of their luxury goods, paintings that had mythological subject matter, jewels, textiles of great luxury, anything that they thought were objects of sin. And we know that artists came under the spell of Savonarola as well. Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus we've looked at, threw all the mythological paintings he had in his studio into the fires, and said that had he been able to get his hands on the mythological paintings he had painted for private patrons, he would have thrown them into the fire as well. He really repented, regretted making those mythological paintings. We know that Michelangelo, too, came under the spell of Savonarola, perhaps not in regards to the Medici family, but certainly he takes something from Savonarola's teachings that sticks with him. Certainly, Michelangelo carries a very heavy burden of, feeling guilty about sin, and he documents this in the form of the poetry that he writes um, throughout his life. One area that may have caused Michelangelo particular chagrin may have been his sexuality. Renaissance homosexuality, well, in a way, sort of doesn't exist in the same way that we describe homosexuality, and it's a bit of a complicated issue. But what we do know is that as long, there was a real difference, distinguish between desire and physical act. And so while the physical act was viewed as an absolutely mortal sin, that same-sex desire was at the very least more acceptable. And in fact, especially in Florence, it was kind of a component of society that especially older men would have these relationships with younger men that were at least purportedly not physical, at least not always or not usually physical, but were based on this idea that really comes from uh, ancient Greek and Roman culture of the important sort of educational value of older men having friendships, amicizia, with younger men. Anyway, we know that Michelangelo had experienced same-sex desire. He fell very much in love with a young man. His name is Tommaso Cavalieri, and we may talk about him later on. But this seems to have created some torment for Michelangelo. He's very pious, and as far as we know, he never acted on his desire, never committed that physical act. And, you can imagine how difficult that might be if you're in love and have a relationship with someone. So, a challenging part of Michelangelo's life, to be sure. 1498 is an important year as well. So 1492 is the death of Lorenzo. Savonarola is brought in. Lorenzo, for a while kind of didn't care very much about what Savonarola was saying about him, but surely by the end of his life he was saying that Savonarola was really becoming quite powerful, and Lorenzo evidently started to get a little nervous about maybe Savonarola's right, and he didn't want to end up going to hell. And so on his deathbed, he calls in Savonarola and asks him to perform his last rites and also to absolve him of his sins. And while it would be much, much, much more common for someone to be absolved of their sins, Savonarola famously leans over to Lorenzo and whispers in his ear that he instead is damned to hell, and Lorenzo dies soon thereafter. Savonarola's power as a religious leader melds quickly into political power as well, and he sort of took an unofficial role of ruling Florence, at least for a few years. By 1498, the Florentines had absolutely had it with this strict aesthetic lifestyle that Savonarola demanded, and ganged up on him. There was a revolt, and Savonarola and his closest allies, his brothers, the closest ones around Savonarola, were dragged to this site right in front of Palazzo Vecchio and were burned at the stake. And there's a circular plaque in the pavement in Palazzo Vecchio that shows that site where Savonarola was killed. So that happens in 1498, but already Michelangelo had left Florence. He left soon after Lorenzo's death, in part because Lorenzo's heir, Piero, was really not equipped to handle the challenge of Savonarola, and I don't know. Anyway, Piero just kind of wasn't meant to be a ruler and ends up fleeing Florence, and you can hardly blame him considering the climate. But before he goes, Michelangelo says to him, I'm here, I've got free time, I worked a lot for your father, and I could do work for you. And Piero just doesn't take advantage of this amazing opportunity to have Michelangelo work for him and asks him to do a snowman for him when there was a snowstorm in Florence. And that's one of the only things that Michelangelo ever did for Piero, was to build a snowman. Piero flees, and Michelangelo leaves Florence and heads to Rome with the promise of fruitful patronage there. At this point in Rome's history, and we'll be talking about Rome in a separate unit, but Rome was still in the process of rebuilding. The church had, really, the whole city of Rome had declined significantly after the sack of Rome in the 5th century, and was still working on rebuilding. And a lot of that rebuilding starts to take place in the course of the 15th century. One of the demands of the church in the course of the 15th century is that the cardinals of the church must have a residence and a church in Rome that they take care of. And because of that demand, it meant that cardinals from all over were in Rome at least for part of the year, had growing ties to the city, and were responsible for the decoration and the upkeep of their churches and their private residences. This obviously translated into a great source of commissions for artists. So artists start to flock to Rome. Michelangelo goes to Rome and he works for a banker initially and does a sculpture of Bacchus for him. And while the sculpture wasn't terribly successful in some ways, it did help him to get to the into the attention or come to the attention of a French cardinal, Jacques Belair Lagrula, who asked Michelangelo to make a sculpture. We think the sculpture was intended for Lagrula's tomb that was in a chapel adjoining the Basilica of St. Peter's. For the subject matter, Michelangelo was tasked with doing a pietà. And pietà really means piety and pity sort of all rolled up in one, and really was meant to evoke an emotional response from the viewer that would inspire greater piety. And so it didn't have to be a virgin and child image, though that's often what they are, and that's obviously what it is in this case. We have the virgin who has on her lap Christ right after he's been taken off of the cross. His body's limp and dead. And that's communicated to us in a number of ways. The positioning of the limbs, just this dead weight, and you can tell the struggle of holding the body up, and then this weight of the arm just dangling down. The very relaxed expression of Christ, and we'll see a detail of that in a moment, and the dangling legs over here of Christ. Christ here, of course, is supposed to be 33 years old. His mother would have been considerably older looking than she appears here. But again, the idea is that the Virgin, because of her purity, didn't age, and so she's shown as perpetually young and free from sin. This was a major sculptural achievement for many reasons, but one of them is because Michelangelo carved this two-figure group out of one block of stone. This was a challenge to Renaissance artists because they had read Pliny, and Pliny describes how ancient artists were able to carve multiple figures out of single blocks of stone. It requires a great deal of technical skill to be able to pull off such a feat. So it's a big deal that Michelangelo was able to do this, and needless to say, this young artist is eager to pull off this thing because he's working on this from about the time he's 21, and he wants to show off all he is capable of. He really wants this to make his name, and it does so. There's no doubt about it. But at first, or at least the story is told, that there was some confusion about who had carved this sculpture. After it's set into place in this chapel, and I should point out that it was originally set on the floor, not up on a pedestal we see it today, and unfortunately, because we see it elevated, it's distorted the proportional relationships that Michelangelo had intended for the viewer to see. It changes that viewpoint too drastically. In any case, when this sculpture was unveiled, Michelangelo was standing behind a pillar, eavesdropping to see what people had to say about it. And he heard these two Milanese gentlemen come in front of the sculpture, walk around, look at it, and say, "Oh my goodness, what a fabulous job our sculptor Gobo of Milan has done in making this amazing thing. What an amazing artist he is." And Michelangelo was mortified. He couldn't believe this great achievement of his was being credited to this two-rate, second-rate artist, Gobo di Milano, an artist that we know actually existed. So the story goes that Michelangelo snuck in during the night and carved his name on this strip of fabric that cuts across the chest of the Virgin. And it says, "Michelangelo Buonarroti from Florence made this," lest there be any further doubt about who should be given the credit for this sculpture. As we look at some of the details of the sculpture, what I would want you to notice is the great delicacy with which Michelangelo has carved this group, and particularly the features of the Virgin, how we get a sense of the melancholy of the Virgin, the sense of sadness, but it's not dramatic, emotive experience here. It is subtle. We get a sense, perhaps, of the Virgin's, that she's sort of resigned to the fate of her son, that she understands that he will be resurrected. This kind of all-knowingness of the Virgin, which is often the way Michelangelo depicts her. In the fabric, I would certainly want you to see how interested Michelangelo is in making the fabric behave as fabric, as I pointed out to you in La Madonna delle Scale, the Madonna of the Stairs. You can see that Michelangelo has carved the marble so that it is, just beautifully done and then carefully polished. And he's really thought about where pockets of shade would be as the sculpture was lit, so as to make it even more realistic, that the object casts shade in a way that makes sense. Some other details, this obviously the hand of Christ over his lap. A detail of the face of Christ, these totally relaxed features. It's really meant to communicate death or sleep, and you can interpret Christ's death in both ways, really, since in fact he is not permanently dead but resurrects 3 days later. A beautiful photograph here of the hands of Christ and of the Virgin, who has her hand out. And we can understand that as a way to communicate to the viewer, look at this, look at what has been done. But also, sort of drawing the viewer in to contemplate the sacrifice of the mother and obviously of the son, and that this was done for our sake. This is definitely an image that is meant to really make the viewer, the worshiper specifically, contemplate this sacrifice, contemplate the divine and human elements of Christ. And the Virgin, in her gesturing, also makes us understand and emphasizes that relationship between the body of Christ and the sacrament of the Eucharist, where we have the bread of the Eucharist symbolizing the body of Christ. That's made clear here because there is this bit of drapery that makes it so the Virgin's hand does not touch the skin of Christ directly. And it mimics the way priests cover their hands with cloth as they hold the host, the bread of the Eucharist, even in the Catholic Church today. this one of the most fabulous tattoos I've ever seen. But I love it. It certainly is an example of how this sculpture is just universally known and regarded as one of the great masterpieces of the period. It still has cultural currency in that way. I will stop here and we will pick up with Michelangelo's David in the next lecture.